Hey traders, welcome back to the weekly Forex Forecast. Last week we had a really nice reversal to the upside in the dollar off of non-farm payrolls, and we closed above the 7-year breakout. It does set up a rally into the high of the year in short order, and going into next week, US dollar pairs alongside the pound pairs once again are setting up to be the best markets next week. Okay, 3 things to pay attention to in the economic calendar next week. We have Labor Day on Monday, so I expect a lack of volatility, and generally speaking, it's probably going to be good to have this day off. Markets are likely to start, therefore, moving on Tuesday, and we have an interest rate decision out of Australia. So when we look at the Aussie pairs, I'm going to be interested in trading them from Tuesday onwards after the interest rate decision takes place. And the same with the Canadian dollar pairs. This is the third and final thing really we need to pay attention to in terms of short-term trading. There are other pieces of data, but it's the Canadian dollar interest rate decision on Wednesday. I'm looking to trade the CAD pairs from Wednesday onwards as well after the interest rate decision. So the key takeaways this week in the scorecards are that the Swiss franc pairs, which have been good long plays recently, have now peaked in the scorecards, so they come out of the watch list this week. I do therefore like the pound and the dollar to the upside as my 2 favorite longs in the currency complex this week, as well as the Canadian dollar, but bear in mind we have the interest rate decision on Wednesday, so CAD pairs to the long side will be from Wednesday onwards, given the opportunity. And to the short side, it is the Japanese yen once again that I do favour down here as the best short, followed by the New Zealand dollar, then the Australian dollar, which again, I'm only going to be looking at Aussie shorts from Tuesday onwards. And we can also look at the euro potentially this week if you like for shorts as well, because although this is not very, very negative and it's not the most bearish currency, it has moved into the negative side and it does have some negative momentum. So primarily pound yen, pound New Zealand, US dollar yen to the upside once again, which last week bounced really nicely from its lower bound. And also New Zealand dollar to the downside. I really like those, but we'll also be looking at Aussie shorts and euro shorts vis-a-vis those and the Canadian dollar this week. Looking at the individual currencies on the weekly chart here, just to get the bigger picture view, you can see the dollar is still making its way towards the high of the year of the 105.883. So although I like dollar pairs next week, this probably has some in the tank over the next few weeks as well, just in the bigger picture worth keeping in mind. And like I say, US dollar long plays are once again, and actually US dollar long plays paid very nicely last week. They are once again on the top of my watch list next to the pound pairs, which over the course of this year have been very, very good longs. Next is the euro, and you can see here as well how this now looks like it's coming down to this low, and that is likely to coincide with a rally into the yearly high, or the high of the year, I should say, in the dollar. So I do like this for further downside, and when we get to the 1.06710, there's a good chance we could break through here with momentum. So keep an eye on this. I do like euro shorts this week. It's on my list versus the dollar. Next is the pound, and last week the pound to the upside was relatively scoring as a good market, and I think this speaks to the forward-looking nature of the scorecards. You can see that actually last week, although the pound had a bit of a weak close here, relative to the other markets, this was actually one of the stronger pairs. So yes, we did get a little bit of sell-off versus the dollar, but this did hold up. And once again, going into this week, I do like the pound on a relative basis. In fact, this is still making high highs and high lows, even in the bigger picture. I do like the pound on a relative basis, and pound yen, pound New Zealand, euro pound, these are 3 of my top markets going into next week. Next is the Swiss franc. Now, ever since the start of the year, I highlighted the 1.17 for you guys, and once we took that target out, you can see the sell-off we've had, and the Swiss franc has been struggling since then. So even on a relative basis, I don't really like the Swiss franc going into next week. Maybe this needs to pull back a little bit more. So it's off the watch list this week. It's not a very good short. I wouldn't want to short Swiss francs, but it's no longer a good buy. In fact, it's kind of a wait and see what happens next. Next is the yen. Now, we're not yet seeing the deflationary, recessionary regime kicking into global markets. And this is suggestive, if we're going to get a bit more stagflation, this is suggestive of a run into the lows in the Japanese yen. And this has been on the short side for a while here. And once again, I am looking for this, in fact, yen shorts to be one of the better markets next week. I still think we have legs down into the prior low at the very least before we start seeing a deflationary or recessionary regime kicking into global markets. Next is the Canadian dollar. Now, I am looking at this to the upside versus the yen and the New Zealand dollar next week. However, this is not individually a very, very strong market. And so if I am going to be looking at CAD yen to the upside, which is on my watch list in blue here to denote that we have a big news event we need to pay attention to during the week. CAD yen to the upside, New Zealand CAD to the downside are on my watch list, but we need to see a positive reaction from the interest rate decision on Wednesday. If we get that and we get the CAD rallying, then I'll be looking at New Zealand CAD to the downside, CAD yen to the upside. If we don't get that, and in fact we get a negative reaction from the CAD, I will leave the Canadian dollar pairs altogether, because next week the CAD for me is an either be long or do nothing market. I cannot short the CAD next week. Next is the Aussie. Now, I've been highlighting this low here all year, in fact, and we are now making our way down to here. And next week, with the interest rate decision on Tuesday, very much like the CAD pairs, I am looking to either short the Aussie or do nothing. And what I would like to see is, I would like to see a negative reaction from the Australian interest rate decision. And then I'm going to try and step in and trade that in the direction of the interest rate decision. Conversely, and we'll look at this when we look at the markets next, if we get a move which is, let's say, positive in the Australian dollar, but the actual interest rate decision itself, is just kind of as expected or consensus. It's not particularly hawkish. I would consider stepping in and fading some of the Aussie pairs from their upper bound. But again, we'll talk about this when we go through the markets. And finally, the New Zealand dollar. This market did actually strengthen in the scorecard somewhat. However, I have been discussing this down to its low this year, and it does look like we are making our way down. Maybe this corrects a little bit first. Maybe we get a little bit of a pause in the dollar first. But I really am only going to be short the New Zealand dollar or doing nothing. I'm not buying the New Zealand dollar from these levels. And preferably pound New Zealand to the upside and also New Zealand dollar to the downside. These are the markets I'm primarily looking for opportunities in next week. Last week, crude oil was a market highlighted to the upside, and you can see we did have a nice breakout and we traded right into the upper bound and through it. This was a very, very strong market, and actually it is indicative of further upside this week. It's one of the reasons why I also like the Canadian dollar to the long side, because a strong crude oil price is going to be supportive of the Canadian dollar via the balance payments. However, I only want to be long the Canadian dollar if we don't get, a bearish catalyst. And even better still, we have a strong crude oil price to help or support the Canadian dollar, and we get somewhat of a hawkish catalyst from the interest rate decision on Wednesday. That would set up CAD longs towards the end of the week next week. Coming into this week, I have put crude oil in gold, and I do like crude oil to the upside. So any pullback in crude oil is viewed as an opportunity to look for bullish breakouts, once again, very similar to last week, into the 90 area. And if we pull all the way back, if we fail to break out and we pull back into the 8250, this would be the second place. So first intra-week breakout. The second place would be a test of the 8250 area. This would be a second place I'll be looking for a long opportunity in crude oil next week. Next is pound yen. You can see this market has already been consolidating. So any continued pullback is viewed as an opportunity next week to look for bullish breakouts into the previous high. This would be a good target because it sits right at the start of the upper bound. And if we just continue to pull back and we trade into the 18150, this would be the second area next week. I'd be looking for a short-term buying opportunity in pound yen. Pound New Zealand, also a market which has corrected from the highs. So I am looking for this to continue higher. And next week, what I'm looking for is a breakout. If I get this breakout intra-week and a pullback, this would be an opportunity to look for longs into the 2.1450. And again, as always, if we pull back and we hold this trend and we trend down into the 2.09250, this would be the second place next week. I'd be looking for a short-term buy opportunity in pound New Zealand. Next is euro pound. Now, this is a market I do like to the downside. We've already started to break out here. And so what I'll be looking for is any continued correction. This would be the opportunity to look for bearish reversals next week into the previous low. Sits right in the lower bound. So I do like this as a target if you are shorting euro pound next week, or we get the opportunity to short euro pound next week. And if we continue to just consolidate and correct, maybe test this high and we pull back into the 0.86250, it's the second place next week. If we fail to break the trend and we just pull back into here, then I'll be looking for a short-term short opportunity in euro pound. Next is pound Aussie. Now this is in blue to show that we do have that interest rate decision next week out of Australia. So I'll be leaving this until that takes place on Tuesday. I would imagine this is likely to do nothing, especially with Labor Day on Monday. So coming into Tuesday, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the interest rate decision itself to break this out to the upside. What does that mean? It means that the interest rate decision, whatever happens, we get a bearish or negative reaction from the Aussie. This should break pound Aussie higher, and this would be pretty much my first favorite Aussie pair. So the currency I would like to go long most after this would be the US dollar. But I'll be looking for this to pull back, and I'm going to be looking for a follow through into the 1.9775 area. Now, I spoke about at the beginning of the video if we get the opportunity to fade the interest rate decision, and what that might look like is this. If we just consolidate and then on the interest rate decision, we get a sell-off into the 1.9250. What this means is, and again, I've said this in prior videos, you don't want to step in front of a freight train. If you get a sell-off in pound Aussie because you've got a very strong bullish reaction from the Australian dollar, and it's accompanied by a hawkish catalyst. In other words, let's say the Reserve Bank of Australia smashed interest rates up unexpectedly by a significant amount. You're not going to want to step in and fade that Australian dollar strength. But if you see the Australian dollar strengthening for no real apparent reason, this would be another area, the 1.9250, that I'll be looking for a potential fading of the interest rate decision next week. I can either be short the Australian dollar next week or do nothing. Buying Australian dollar next week is not an option for me. Moving on to the US dollar pairs, starting with US dollar yen, and this was a market highlighted to the upside last week, and the buy area was tested almost to the wick here at the 144.50, and this was a great opportunity to trade actually non-farm payrolls at the end of the week. Remember, non-farm payrolls, very often the first move is the wrong move. So this is exactly the kind of setup you can take advantage of if you're looking to trade non-farm payrolls. So coming into this week, this is a market to the upside once again that I do like. Any pullback is viewed as the opportunity to look for a bullish breakout up towards the 148.250 area. And very much like last week, if we just trend all the way down, look how we just held this trend all the way down into the lower bound over here. If we do that again, and we just continue down, and we test the 144.50 area once again, this is a place you can this week look for the same over here, a short-term bounce and a buying opportunity in US dollar yen next week. Next is New Zealand dollar. Now this was a market highlighted to the short side last week, and we traded right in to the sell zone here, and I did in fact short this last week from these areas up here, and I got out of it down here. So this was a nice short, and you can see once again when I say to you, trade into the upper bound here, if we do that this week, I'm going to be looking for the same short-term sell-off. If you trade into the upper bound, you're very unlikely going to come all the way down, test the lower bound in the same week. Usually it will do one or the other. So great opportunity to trade this to the short side last week. On my watch list once again as one of my favorite markets. Any pullback is viewed this week as the opportunity to look for a bearish breakout into the 0.5850. And if we just pull all the way back like we did last week into the 0.6030, this is an area once again I'd be interested in looking for a short-term trade to the downside in New Zealand dollar. Next is euro dollar. Now I like this to the downside because we have that negative momentum in the euro, and we don't have the interest rate decision like we do in the Aussie and the Canadian dollar next week. And you can see last week we traded right into the sell zone here and we reversed sharply. So a really good opportunity to short this market last week, highlighted in last week's video. Coming into this week, I can either be short euro dollar or do nothing. Buying this market is not an option for me next week. Any pullback is viewed, and we've started to already break out here by the looks of it, so any pullback is viewed as an opportunity to look for bearish breakouts into the 1.0660. And just like last week, if we continue to pull back and we test, and you can see there's a high over here, if we test this and we trade into the 1.0880, this is the second place next week. I'm going to be looking for a potential short-term selling opportunity in euro dollar. And the final dollar pair is Aussie dollar. This was a market highlighted for a good short last week, and we traded right into the sell area at the 0.650, and we sold off from here. And actually this, alongside New Zealand dollar, was also a good short for me last week. Coming into this week, any continued pullback is viewed as an opportunity to look for bearish reversals, but I'm going to be looking at this again from the interest rate decision on Tuesday. So if we break down on the interest rate decision, I'm going to be looking for a correction of follow through into the prior low and the 0.6350 area roughly, let's say. Or if we get just the market moving sideways and then on Tuesday it spikes into the 0.6540, but we do not have any real hawkish catalyst to support this move, this would be the area I'd be looking for a short-term fading opportunity next week after the interest rate decision on Tuesday. Wrapping up the video with the CAD pairs, we do have the interest rate decision on Wednesday, so this is only after the interest rate decision I'm really interested in this. If we get the market consolidating, which I think is likely before Wednesday, and then we get a bullish breakout, I'm going to be looking for a pullback and a follow through into the 109.20. But conversely, if we just consolidate and then we get a sell-off from the interest rate decision into the 106 area, but there is no obvious bearish catalyst for the Canadian dollar. In other words, we can look at this essentially as a bit of a mispricing. This would be the second place I'd be looking for a short-term buy opportunity in CAD yen next week. I can either be long CAD yen or do nothing next week. So if we get a bearish or a dovish interest rate decision or rate statement or whatever on Wednesday and the Canadian dollar sells off, I will just leave this altogether. But if it sells off and there's no real bearish catalyst, or if it breaks out, especially on a hawkish catalyst, I'll be looking for long opportunities after Wednesday. And the final pair here is New Zealand CAD. Just as with CAD yen, I can either be short New Zealand CAD or do nothing next week. Buying this is not an option, so I'm looking for one of two things. Either we get a breakout in the direction of the bias that I'm looking at and we start to pull back. I'm going to be looking for a follow through into the 0.7980 and the lows down here. Or conversely, if we get New Zealand CAD spiking after the interest rate decision, but there's no real dovish or bearish catalyst for the Canadian dollar, which explains this move, in other words, just a bit of volatility, I would be looking to potentially fade this after Wednesday from the 0.8170 area roughly for a short-term selling opportunity. Wrapping up the video with gold, silver, and Bitcoin. Starting with gold, this was a market highlighted for a potential short opportunity from the 1950 area. And you can see we traded into this and we did have a short-term sell-off. Nothing dramatic, to be honest with you, but if you were looking short gold last week, the opportunity was from the 1950 area. Coming into this week, because of my bullish bias in the dollar, I can either be short gold or do nothing. Buying this is not an option. So any continued pullback is viewed as an opportunity to look for bearish reversals into the 1905 area, or if we continue to pull back just like last week into the 19750, this is the second place next week. I'd be looking for a near-term short in gold. Next is silver. This was a market highlighted in last week's video for a short opportunity, and we traded right into the 25 area and we had a really nice sell-off. So good opportunity to short silver from this area last week. Coming into this week, I can either be short silver or do nothing. Buying this market is not an option for me. So any pullback is viewed once again as an opportunity to look for bearish reversals, and to be honest, you started breaking out somewhat here. I'm going to be looking for another breakout to the downside into the 2340 area. And just like last week, if we continue to trend back and we double top up in this area, especially if we test this high, I will once again be looking for a potential short from the 25 area, given the chance next week. And last but not least, we have Bitcoin. Now, this was highlighted to the downside in last week's video, and we traded right into the 27,600. And this was where Bitcoin topped out and then started to sell off. So a really nice opportunity to short Bitcoin from the area highlighted in last week's video. Coming into this week, I still favor shorts in Bitcoin on balance. So any pullback is viewed as an opportunity for those of you trading it to look for bearish breakouts into the 24,400, or if like last week we continue to pull back into the 27,200, this would be the second place next week. I would consider a short-term sell opportunity in Bitcoin. So that is it for me for this week, guys. As always, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, why not consider joining us in the room each day where I go through these markets and the setups that I'm personally looking at with members on a daily basis for over 75 markets in different asset classes, including stocks, bonds, forex, and commodities.